welcome to our 78th, I think it's kind of a seminar, but it's more of a dialogue. We are very grateful to have a special installment of our seminar series this week. We have our director, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, with us today. There has been a lot of changes and fluid movement in the region, particularly about very consequential issues in foreign policy and international relations. As we speak, we have an American armada off the coast of Iran, and at the same time we have what is usually called gunboat diplomacy, literally, where the American naval fleet is off the coast of Iran, and at the same time trying to have a regional restructuring through a negotiation with the Iranian regime. To better understand what's happening in the region, we have invited our director, who is an expert on the Middle East, and very specifically on American foreign policy, including the very specific U.S. and Iran relationship. So, where would you like to start?
Well, I mean, certainly the U.S. and Iran go a long way back. And not only because of what happened in 1953, but even before that, as Iran has become towards the region one of the major suppliers of oil. It was of great interest first to the British, to the Russians, and later on to the Americans. But certainly America after World War II, the overriding strategic imperative for it is to make sure that it will be dominant in this region. And after World War II, we saw that there was a waning of British power and obviously the ascendance of American power. And it was very imperative during the Cold War that the US insists that the Soviets would never be able to go to what's called the warm waters. And to do that, they have to go through Persia, through Iran. So they consolidated their presence in the Middle East through many initiatives, but one of the most important that is still people remember, because it is a very painful memory for the Iranians, was the 1953 coup. That 1953 coup was when they installed the Shah, who was the son of the former Shah, and it was basically a British colony, British country, and the US wanted to take a stake, wanted to take part of the oil. Colonel Roosevelt at the time, who was the chief agent, CIA agent in the region, orchestrated what's called the AJAC operation, which is basically to restore the Shah. During that time, there was a nascent democratic experiment by a prime minister who was a nationalist, by the name of Mohammad Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh wanted to nationalize because, according to the previous agreement, the Iranians were getting only about 16% of the oil, which is nothing. This is their own oil. It reminds you of what's happened today in Venezuela. At least nothing has changed. But anyway, so he wanted to get half, but they would deny that. So they orchestrated a coup by which he was removed from office. The Shah fled, was restored. And it's very painful memories for the Iranians. And then the Shah had to rule through a very repressive regime and the secret police called Sabahattin. Horrible situation. During that time, there were many so-called reforms, and many of the religious leaders, including Imam Khomeini, opposed what the Shah was doing, not only in relationship to the foreign presence, particularly American companies and American influence, and American taking over the oil industry and others, but also the close relationship he had with Israel and others. So it was a process that extended from 1963, when Khomeini was exiled, first in Baghdad in Iraq, later later on in France for a few months. And there was a revolution. That revolution was the pushback, the payback, the blowback, what actually happened in 1953. And it was very much anti-American because they thought that it was America who actually stopped, flaunted the experiment, and therefore it was a very dark page in the relationship. A few months after that, the Americans were trying also to deal with the situation in a way that they were not sure how. Bear in mind that this happened in February 1979. About when Carter was the president at the time, when he took over the United States, he had a very close relationship with the Shah. He called it Island of Stability. And the first country actually visited outside North America was Iran in 1977. So there was that kind of thing. The Iranians were very angry about this still after over 2 decades, a quarter century. And the students took over the embassy.
Wait, before we get to the embassy takeover, there has been recent kind of archival work in which the relation between Iran and the U.S. has been a little bit complicated. Like, for example, the days leading up to Khomeini's return, there were backdoor negotiations between Khomeini's team and the United States, in which Khomeini assured the United States that there would be a peaceful transition and also assured American interests in the region. Alongside that, it seems like the American intelligence officer in the region, I can't remember his name at the moment, but he asked the Iranian military to not shoot down the plane because obviously, I mean, he's returning with much fanfare from France. So there's a kind of doubt, about Khomeini's status as a genuine leader from the streets, or whether or not there was some kind of other plan.
I haven't been able to come across any evidence of this. What we know is that some people around Khomeini were not very close to him, but they had close relationship. Many of them actually lived in the States, in which they were given assurances. But there is no evidence that Khomeini himself was dealing with the Americans directly, or even the French for that matter. I think Khomeini was very adamant. In fact, he was asked not to go back, and he insisted on going back. They were trying to deal with him. They thought he's a cleric, he's going to go back. I mean, very similar to what Tistani was doing in the prelude to the American invasion. He would actually stay behind. He didn't get involved in politics. Khomeini is different. A person altogether. That's not Khomeini.
No, I'm saying to understand the psychology of the modern Iranian state. Khomeini plays a central role in that.
Absolutely. And I've read anything that had to deal with Khomeini directly. I've probably read, but I haven't come across. And for those who interviewed him, whether it was from Whaley, Halkalı, and others, it was very clear that he was trying to stay away from having any direct relationship with the Americans. But he did not prevent others from opening channels, which gave a little bit of confusion. But I don't believe that Khomeini had a tacit understanding with the Americans on anything.
I see.
And but Carter himself was sending messages all the time. Khomeini's tactics has always been to be ambiguous. He had a very definite program in mind. He had an Islamic constitution. He had an Islamic model that he wanted to institute.
Yeah.
He was very focused on that. And he was trying, during the early days to make sure that he can unite the Iranians behind this. So most of the steps that he took were not directly confrontational, even though he was very adamant about the Shah. He was not willing to negotiate any kind of return or any kind of presence for the Shah or those who could be called the senior members of his administration, the Shah's
I mean,
administration.
just from a security perspective, how do you read Khomeini's French years? I mean, like the fact that he was openly camping out in France, known to the French intelligence. He also had, I think at some point, he also had like security on the street. That, I mean, mean, it was obvious that the Americans and the French knew where he was.
Of course.
And
No, it wasn't.
how come he wasn't, why do you think he was protected by French?
I wouldn't call it protected.
I see.
I would call it he was not a very well-known figure. And you have to understand, we're not 2025, 2026. We're 1978,
Yeah,
79.
can you tell us more about what that means?
1978, 79, the meaning of a cleric and involved in politics was basically ambiguous or unknown. How would somebody like him be perceived? Okay, is it a religious figure, respected religious figure? He may have certain interests here and there. But does that translate into a head of government? Does that translate into a person with a political program? He wasn't very well known. We're not in the age of this mass information presence. He came out of nowhere, and the reason he was popular at the time is because of his opposition in the early 60s and throughout the 60s against the Shah, but more importantly, he had these cassettes, which were in Persian, mostly heard by students, by revolutionaries.
Yeah, I remember even when I was young, I still remember hearing cassette tapes of clergies and imams and shiur.
And he speaks in code, so it doesn't get translated properly for those who are experts. That's why, on one hand, the CIA and the American government says Iran is an island of stability, and then within months they found it's turmoil. It's exploding. They did not expect it. The CIA did not expect this at all, let alone. And they thought, okay, he's a phenomenon. He's gonna come and go. So they did not. Had they thought, in my belief, had they thought that he would be as dangerous as they thought later on that he became, probably they would have assassinated him and did something about it.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting position because before revolutionary moments, we often see revolutionaries using what is called strategic ambiguity, right? Because they are trying to balance both trying to keep legitimacy at home and not rivaling or poking the bear, great powers who could obstruct the historical process. So many times, even in post-colonial literature, we see a lot of anti-revolutionary actors using this kind of saying, yes, we'll establish relations with everybody, we'll have friendly relations with everybody. But like you said, people who are in the know the code.
There's another element, also very important, which has to do with the circle around him. Khomeini was very smart in keeping many different people around him. So the Russians would be speaking to the leftists, the Americans would be speaking to those who grew up in the West. They would get different assurances. And he would not comment, because he has a very focused program to make sure the Shah will fall, that he will be the coming leader, that this revolution will succeed. And he hid his cards pretty close to his vest. So everybody thought that he's the closest to Khomeini, but no one was really the closest to Khomeini.
So he was a very skilled political tactician.
Very skilled. And then he had around him, of course, his own students. These students were communicating to the people. These are the people who went to the streets. These are the people who actually carried the revolution on their shoulders. These are the people who went and demonstrated in the streets like Mutahari and Muntaziri and others. These are the people who carried the people into the streets, and they were able also to carry his instructions, to stay away from violence, to stay away from any kind of things that can give the Shah even more ammunition. They kept killing people, and they kept, at least at the beginning, throwing flowers and rice and doing all kinds of things to give this appearance that this is a popular, peaceful revolution.
Maybe we can return to now where we left off, which was the.
So what happened is that the Shah pressure Saddam Hussein said to leave. Now these people who were in the West, they were able to arrange for him to go to the Novel Chateau, which is the place where he stayed. And again, there wasn't this feeling with the intelligence agencies that he would be able to go there triumphant.
So they just basically underestimated him.
I think completely underestimated. And I think they were trying actually to find a way to bridge the differences. Perhaps he could accept some sort of the Shah leaving, like they did back in 1953. The Shah left, they brought someone like,
Technocrat.
yeah, and they were doing that, and they actually chose someone who was very close to the Shah, but Khomeini had none of that. He insisted he want to go back. And it would have been pretty difficult to kill him. Anyway, he came back and he insisted, he landed. Now this American to shoot an airliner at that time would have been a scandal. Who's going to shoot it for what purpose? But you know, you never know. But so what happened is that he came very focused and he wanted to he told people, now he's undisputed that he is the charismatic leader of this revolution. He had a definite program, definite model that he wants to implement, that he's been talking about for over 15 years, since at least 1963, which is based on his conception of what an Islamic government is. And in his thought, actually, it's revolutionary because the traditional Shia perspective on this is that we don't do this until the Imam comes back, the hidden Imam comes back. So for him to present an Islamic government or a form of an Islamic government outside the presence of a hidden Imam is anathema to the traditional Shia thought.
It's kind of messianic. Traditional Shiism has a kind of messianic belief about the return of the Mahdi.
Yes, exactly. So his was like, no, why should we can prepare the grounds for him and he can come and rule. So this was not a traditional idea. This was actually a revolutionary idea. And he was able to bring it to the masses.
Mm-hmm.
He had a constitution committee. They drafted that constitution based on this theory, and then they voted. I think it was something like 98% people approved it. And then he was trying to reconstruct the government. Now, he has this ability also to rule, but at the same time not to impose. So he left it. Actually, the first person who was elected as president turned out to be a person who was not in support of this idea. He was actually very close to the West, and he was exposed and then fled as a woman. He dressed as a woman and fled. That's Abu Hassan bin Sadr. He was an economist. And then very quickly, within a year, and obviously the hostages came in November '79, but September 1980, when the West encouraged Saddam Hussein to actually invade Iran, it was total chaos. There was a lot of chaos in the streets.
I want to dwell on the hostages for a second.
Okay, let's go back to the hostages.
Because a lot of U.S. foreign policy experts and historians of the moment focus on the hostages as being a critical moment. But if you look at American behavior with other states, say the Vietnam War, for example, or other countries in the world, where there has been genuine hostility between the United States and that country, much more damage to American troops, American hardware has been endured by America, yet they don't talk about those things. But in the case of Iran, it's almost like the hostages incident, which between two nations is a small event. It's not such a huge event as, for example, a war would be, and America has been able to reconcile with nations that it's gone to war with. However, in the case of Iran, you hear foreign policy always mentioning the hostages, as if it is this unsurmountable kind of damage that has happened to American prestige, maybe American power, and it needs to be avenged in some way. It doesn't make rational sense.
That's true, but we have to go back and put it in the right context. And the right context is that the Iranians were very wary of the US terrorists. So what happened is that the Shah left Iran, and he started going from country to country. He was from different Mexico to Egypt, different places. He was suffering from cancer, apparently terminal cancer. And they were mentioning the Iranians did not trust that the Americans are not going to reinstall him back.
Mm-hmm.
So they put a line in the sand and said, you can't take back the Shah, you cannot support the Shah. the U.S. was very hesitant. The president at the time, President Carter, he made some strategic errors actually, not on my side, on the side of those people who form foreign policy, in which initially he approved for him to go to the U.S. And that's when the Iranians thought that this is another Mossadegh, this is another attempt to reinstall the Shah. So they stormed the embassy. And of course, eventually the Americans had to expel the Shah. He ended up in Egypt and he died in Egypt. But during that time, the Americans knew. Had they not known, if they thought the government was behind it, it would have been a different reaction. They knew that this was just an initiative by students. They went and stormed the embassy and they took 52 hostages. Actually, there was a little bit more. They released the woman and the black staffer and they left about 52 people. And Khomeini, again, I mean, this guy was really a person who understood strategic decisions. He wanted stability so that he can get his program, his government in place. So he said, no one is going to make an issue, no one is going to take a decision on this until the government is in place. So he left it open. So the hostages stayed, the students stayed until there will be elections, there will be a constitution, there will be elections. After the election, there will be a government, and the government then will negotiate the fate of the hostages. Keep in mind that this was also in the middle of an election year. So this is November 1979, November 4th. So we're going to 1980, that is the election year.
I mean, even calling them hostages is strange because, as the record shows now, the American embassy was what they call a den of spies, right?
So what happened is that when they got to the embassy, the staffers in the embassy, they started shredding papers by the tens of thousands.
Yeah, they had massively
Massive, yeah. And the students were able to get them back and reconstitute them, every single one of them, despite the shreds. And they found that there were all kinds of things happening against Iran during that. And I think until today, you can go and actually watch them and see them. At any rate, so what happened is that they tried. Now, you're talking about why did this take so much time and effort and energy and became a sticking point in the relationship? It's because Carter elevated it that way. And the Americans learned since that time.
And the media also played a big
Of
role.
course. There was programs spinning off of this. There is a daily program that was called America Held Hostage that stayed there for over 400 days, every single night on ABC News. The state couple that's how he got his fame out of this program, in which they would discuss every single night. So the whole country was obsessed on this. How could we? This is a humiliation. How could they take our hostages? We can't get them out. And
it's
actually,
very similar to what the Israelis tried to do with October 7th, where they were obsessing about these hostages to distract.
but the Israelis don't care about it. They wanted to fulfill certain objectives using October 7th. They didn't care. Actually, they killed over half of the hostages, or over half of what were killed in October 7th. But in this situation, clearly Carter obsessed over them. He basically stopped the government. He was doing nothing but hostages constantly. And of course, every president learned after that not to do that, because that would be like a suicide. And indeed, that affected him. They even tried a rescue mission, April 7th. I remember that day, 1980. They trained on this, how they're going to free the hostages. They trained, they built cities, they studied maps, they studied weather, and they went back like 50 years, where there will be Topaz 1, which is the desert, Topaz 2, how they're gonna go, what kind of people. They already had their own people in the street. They had trucks. They planned on having multi-level helicopters and planes coming from different places, and everything they planned for just didn't work out. Every contingency they tried, the Iranians actually didn't know anything about it. The next day, I think it might have been next tax day, April 15th. Anyway, so what happened is that they took hydraulics. They were supposed to be clear day, and what was a sandy day.
Mm-hmm.
There was supposed nobody coming from there. There was buses and cars and other people come in. And eventually 2 helicopters crashed.
Because of a sandstorm.
But it was totally unexpected.
Yeah.
So they aborted The Iranians actually heard about it from Carter himself 7 o'clock in the morning. So it did, and when it failed, it was another failure, another humiliation. Here is the strongest army that couldn't even rescue these people. So anyway, so it was a plot, and then the Iranians were able to extract a lot of concessions. And they humiliated Carter even further because he was defeated that election year, and they did not allow the transfer of hostages until Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. So it didn't even happen in Carter's time, it happened in Reagan's time.
Yes. So, you were saying that there's this relationship between the United States and Iran has many years in the making.
Yes, and basically, not only because of this strained relationship that started in the 50s, not because of the exploitation, not because of help the Shah to repress his people, not because also of what happened in the revolution, but also after that, it was very clear, particularly during the Reagan administration, is that they had it for Iran. People talk about the Iran-Contra affair, but that's a completely different context, which happened in the mid-80s, and it has to do with America's foreign policy towards Latin America and Nicaragua in particular, not because of Iran. Iran just incidental to this issue. Because what happened is that the United States started conspiring against Iran. Didn't like Khomeini, didn't like what he stood for, didn't like the fact that American companies were out, didn't like the fact that he closed. First thing he did, the first act that he did was closing the Israeli embassy and making it into Palestinian embassy. And of course, Zionists were on the ascendants. They really had great influence with the Reagan administration. By the way, if you go back, 10 US presidents, from Nixon to Trump, everybody cast a veto. Guess who is the president who cast vetoes the most? By far. Ronald Reagan, 18 out of 52. Everybody else, 2, 3, 4, 5, maximum 6, 18 times. Was filled with Zionist influences because of the Lebanon war, the invasion of Lebanon. Anyway.
But I mean, the Iranians closing the embassy in Tehran just normalizes them, because at that time there weren't any embassies for Israel in the region, right? Or any kind of.
I mean, they just exchanged. Obviously, that happened in '82. There wasn't. That's true. I mean, there was in Turkey, and then Iran.
Yeah, Turkey is a special case.
Right. It was 1950s. Anyway, so when we talk about the Iranian vis-a-vis U.S. policy in the region, it was a fight because of 1953. They didn't trust the Americans. And the Americans didn't like what they stood for. And then they instigated, or at least encouraged, or at least looked the other way when Saddam invaded Iran. In fact, they gave him logistical support. Even though
they gave him green light, wasn't it kind of like they...
Most experts would say so,
yeah.
That they gave him green light, they allowed him to invade Iran, that they gave him logistical support, they gave him intelligence, and more importantly, the regimes in the region, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, they financed this whole operation to the tune of at least $80 billion. And that was the main reason why Saddam invaded Kuwait later on. Because then the Americans, after the end of this war, 8 years later, they pressured the Kuwaitis to ask for that money back. And Iraq was completely bankrupt.
Okay, here I want to raise a question that is very, I mean, if you read or you hear Gulf experts or Arab experts talk about this, they cast the relationship between Iran and the Gulf as a historical matter over territorial disputes. That basically Iran and the Gulf have very historical disputes, like the Shatt al-Arab and other islands in the Persian Gulf. They try to downplay the ideological, or what you have been describing as the revolutionary character of Iran, saying that, Iran has been bullying the region for a very long time, even during the Shah's time. It wasn't as though Iran was a comfortable partner in the region. How would you respond to that?
We have to go back 3 centuries. We have to go back. First of all, the history of the region is that we have 2 great empires, the Ottoman Empire and the Saudi Empire. Saudi Empire has a lot of influence in this region. And then it waned. Then you have the Qajars. And then the British came and established protectorates. So all these countries, what we call today the Gulf countries, were protectorates under the British. So Iran wasn't, had influence. A lot of them may even have Persian origins, those who live there. Perhaps even as much as half in certain areas, or even more, like in the case of Bahrain and others. So they do have presence there. When you talk Iran as a country, that's a different thing altogether. Now, when the father of the Shah, the Pahlavi dynasty, came along, and that also came through the British. And then he was replaced with this Shah. The Shah wanted to reconstitute a Persian empire that goes back 2,500 years back. And for him to do that, that meant that he has to assert certain power in certain areas. So in 1975, he grabbed certain territories, including some of these islands off the coast of the Emiratis.
Yes.
Even before the Emiratis, they just got their independence at that time, 1972. So when that happened, they couldn't stand up to the Shah. And the British basically allowed it to happen. When the revolution, the Islamic Revolution, came to pass and they wouldn't give up what they had. Actually, they wanted to have some sort of a negotiating presence, but to them, these regimes represent Western influence more than local governments or independent people. So they are very wary on handing over some of these territories. That the Shah.
No, the reason I raised this question is because obviously American military presence, including the current armada that sits off the coast of Iran, there's a kind of continuation from a British protectorate to American protectorate, and the logic of this British to American transition is so deeply in the idea that Iran by itself, regardless of the fact that it has a revolutionary government or not, threatens the territorial integrity of certain Arab kingdoms in the region. This has nothing to do with and the mobilization, for example, of Iranian assets in the region is just an extension.
The worry of the US was not Iran at the time. No one thought that this revolution was about. A lot of people thought that this is a prelude for a Soviet takeover. The Americans, strategically speaking, yes, they were very concerned about an Islamic nature of the government or Iran, but no one thought that this is going to be an existential threat to American dominance or American presence. Everybody thought with the invasion of Afghanistan, of the Soviets, December 1979, that would have been an easy thing for them also to take over Iran, particularly that the leftists were still strong in Iran, whether it's Mujahideen Khalq, whether it is the communists and to the party and others. So America did not have the assets needed to protect this. So immediately Carter, the president at the time, created something called Rapid Deployment Force. And they immediately organized the region under what is called the GCC, what we call the GCC. This came as a response in case the Soviets were going to go take over Iran, or at least a chunk of Iran, to come to the warm waters. And then that would have devastated American presence here. They would be in control of at least partially of the oil-producing states, of the oil-producing facilities.
I see.
So that was the major thing. At the same time, of course, Iran now trying to assert itself. No East, no West, Islamic government, it being independent, raising all these slogans. So they basically unleashed Iraq against it, hoping that it will weaken it or at least put it to size. So that was added. But then America started planning for the long term, which is to establish American bases in the Middle East. America didn't have any bases at the time. It had some presence, but not bases.
What about the British?
The British, long ago, they ceased to become a military power. They do have some presence, training troops and things like that. But Britain is always Europe in general. During even the Cold War, their military power is very limited. Britain is part and parcel of the intelligence operations, of putting a lot of assets in the service of Americans, but they don't call the shots. So this was the transition between the Rapid Deployment Force, which Carter established in 1980, until the mid-80s, in which they started having military bases throughout. Today, for example, the largest naval base outside the United States is in Bahrain. The largest Air Force base outside the United States is in Qatar. So now they have built almost over 60, perhaps 63 military bases in the region. And that's part of the armada that we see today that we probably can talk about. The point I'm trying to make here is that this region is very important for two reasons. America has several regions around the world which are very important to it because they involve powers which compete with the US. So they have to prevent these powers from dominating their region. Europe, that's for Russia, East Asia for China. So they have to have what's called containment policy, make sure these countries do not dominate. But for this region, there is no dominant force. But America has to dominate for two reasons. One is because of oil. Whoever controls this oil basically controls the economy of the world. And two is because of the Israeli presence, the Israeli regime, which plays another role, obviously. We can talk about it. So America wants to dominate here to make sure that no other force would come and dominate here and that they will always be the dominant force. It will not even allow local countries to dominate. It will not allow Turkey to be dominant in its region or Iran dominant in its region. So what does it do? It creates this balance of forces, what they call these countries, to make sure Iran is not strong enough to stand up to it. So the whole base of America's policy now for the past 45 years or so is to make sure Iran does not dominate, to make sure that Iran will be weakened, not just because it has the potential, but also because of its anti-Israel bias, its anti-Israel stand. And we need to actually talk about this.
I actually want to talk about that because in the 70s, I mean, were we in a different era? I mean, Arab regimes at that time, even though they may have been some repressive than others, but generally speaking, at that time, Egypt was still, I mean, in hostilities with, just a few decades ago, there was war between the Arabs and Israel.
Egypt changed.
70s was still a fluid time, wasn't it? I mean,
no,
it wasn't
what
like
happened is after 1973, Sadat made a strategic, actually he made the strategic decision in 1972, 1 year before the 1973 war. He decided that he's going to kick out the Soviet experts, open up to the Americans, hoping that somehow the Americans will embrace it. I mean, Kissinger even talks about that in his memoir. And he says, very strange. So that came to us and said, look, what are you going to give me now that I kicked out the Soviets? He said, we don't pay people after the fact. We could have got a lot had you not, but after that, you're not going to get anything. And then he encouraged him to do something for the Americans to get involved. And that was the purpose of the 1973 war. But at any rate, after 1973 and 1774, Sadat is very famous for saying that this is the last war between the Arabs and Israel. Of course, he was mistaken, but that was what he was claiming. Yeah, he said this is the last war. And then he started.
So that's basically mobilization. I mean,
yes, because he said, I want to be an American tank. I want all what I want. I want the Sinai back, and whatever else, I'm fine with it. So for Israel, this was a strategic decision because Israel faces three existential threats. One of them is a conventional war, and that can't happen without Egypt. So when you remove Egypt from the formula, the threat of conventional war is gone. And of course, the nuclear war is the other, which now that explains a lot about Iran, and before that, Iraq and Syria and others. And the third, of course, is Palestinian demography, and that explains a lot what's happening before Iraq. Anyway, going back. So when Sadat made that strategic decision, he's going to open up to America, which he did. Then he went this visit to Jerusalem, in which he basically normalized on his own.
And Arabs at that time.
So this is now, just to put in context, this is 79. He goes 78 Camp David. He signs the treaty on March 26, 1979. Egypt is totally isolated from the region. Actually, it's kicked out from the Arab League. Egypt is its own. So Iran, by the time Egypt was kicked out, Iran kicked out the Israelis. I mean, it's just same year. The same year. So
the same year.
Same year.
Egypt signed.
February, Iran kicks out the Israelis from Iran. March, Egypt signs with Israel. And then they open the embassies in 1982.
Wow.
because it
Okay.
took 3 years to draw from the Sinai. So when you look at the region, then the region is now is being adapting to this new situation. Now,
But as
after
far as Saddam, for Iraq is concerned, and the other Arab countries, they are still.
they isolate Egypt,
They are.
they break relations with Egypt.
Yeah, they break relations with Egypt. They're still anti-Zionist.
They are anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, at least on the surface of it.
So Iranian's position now is not really revolutionary. It's just coming in line.
Well, I mean,
It's
the
coming
Arabs
back
are
on-
afraid of Iran not because of Palestine, because of the so-called export of the revolution. So they take a very, very hard line stand against Iran because they think now the rhetoric coming from Iran is that we're going to export our revolution, we're going to overthrow all these regimes which are reactive regimes, which are backward regimes, which are non-Islamic, secular, whatever.
Yes.
So they take a very hard stand and they encourage Iraq. As I said, they gave Iraq billions and tens of billions of dollars.
So they didn't welcome Iran into the north, because now Iran is normalizing with the region in a certain sense, because it's moving out of the pro-American camp, and it is now aligning with Arab
But
interests.
these people are pro-American. I mean, because
Yeah.
the Arabs.
Can you clarify?
Yeah, I mean, the Arabs, I mean, when we talk about, again, even going back to the 50s, when there was this tacit, this conflict in the background between Arab regimes which are royal
Mhm.
monarchies versus revolutionaries, republics like Egypt on one hand, later on Libya and Sudan and others, and Syria, and then you have the Saudis and the Jordanians and others, which is very fierce. And that ended actually because of the 1967 war, because all of them lost territory. So these were pro-American, and these were pro-Soviet. So it was still going on. This is, we're talking about 60s now. Now, but getting back to the situation where the Iranians, coming out of revolution, the rhetoric was very high, Islamic rhetoric,
Yes.
independence,
Mhm.
anti-American, and anti-monarchy, because the Shah basically is a monarch.
Mhm.
So they were very afraid. And so that's when sectarianism became the ruling ideology throughout, in order to make sure that the masses will not embrace any kind of revolutionary spirit or revolutionary approach. At the same time, once Egypt normalized with Israel, and there was a withdrawal, the withdrawal ended in April 1982, Israel invaded Iran. That's when the Iranians got really serious about Palestine,
In 82.
June 1982.
I see.
So the Iranians were still in the middle of, they were able to repel the Iraqis. The Iraqis invaded in September 1980. But by June 1982, they were able to repel them for the most part. But Khomeini refused to stop the war because he thought that this is aggression and he has to pay for it. So that war stayed for 8 years, till July 1988. Meanwhile, this invasion in which the Israelis were trying to put new facts on the ground, they were trying to impose, now that conventional war is no longer on the horizon, that is removed as a threat, because the Arabs cannot fight without Egypt. So they wanted to impose, now that Egypt has signed, they wanted to impose peace agreements. And the civil war in Lebanon was raging. So they want to take advantage of this, remove all the Palestinian factions, basically nationalists, Fatah and PFLP and others, and in order to remove them from Lebanon, and then impose in Lebanon a peace treaty. So they invaded Lebanon, they killed tens of thousands, at least 17,000, followed by massacre in Sabra and Shatila, 2,000 to 3,000 people. It was very, very brutal. And then they were able actually to bring their own candidate, who won, but the Syrians at the time, Assad and others, they were able to go after that and kill him, assassinate him. He was replaced by his brother, Jumayr. Then they imposed a peace treaty in favor of Israel on May 17, 1983. Then the Syrians and the national forces, in addition to the Iranians, in addition now to a new movement that started, which we now call it Hezbollah. Hezbollah came as a result of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. There was no Hezbollah.
Yeah.
And Hezbollah came as a response to the brutality of the Israelis.
And at the same time, Hamas comes into formation, right?
Well, that came in the first intifada. We can come to that. But this is very interesting situation. The Americans brokered the treaty or the agreement by which the Palestinian factions would leave Lebanon, what they're trying to do to the Arabs. So the Palestinians, for the most part, Palestinian fighters, they left Lebanon by the thousands. They were scattered over a dozen countries throughout the Arab world. And of course, the Lebanese are Lebanese, they are there. The civil war was still raging in Lebanon. It started in 75, and part of it was because of foreign interference and foreign influence, including the West, France, the US, and Israel. And they were backing a lot of the Christian phalangists who were trying to take over the demography in Lebanon was also changing from the 1940s when they took census numbers. It became much more, you have this sectarian system. At any rate, so they were trying to impose new geopolitical realities on the ground by trying to empower the Christians and have them sign a treaty, because the Israeli plan was to go at least 40 kilometers up north.
And that would secure their northern border.
Exactly.
So you got the south secured by Egypt, and then you got the north.
Exactly, which is a buffer zone for them.
Yes.
And so the civil war is still raging, and the Americans came to bring what is called, like today we have stabilization force, peacekeeping forces. So they brought the Italian, the French, and the Americans, basically by the coast.
It wasn't a UN force?
No.
Oh, it's just like similar to what's happening.
The US imposes whatever it wants.
I see.
So it was basically, it was under the UN, but actually it was 3 countries. It wasn't UN administered. It was American forces, expeditionary forces. It was Marines, and 241 Marines were killed in one day. The biggest losses in the history.
Yeah, who did that? Who was?
Most likely a Shia person who belonged to Hezbollah, because there was no Hezbollah at the time.
I see.
So why? The question is why? Because this is another hostility with Iran. See, is what happened. They were trying to impose certain realities in Lebanon, and because of the civil war, there was this destroyer, this gunship. It's called New Jersey, one of the biggest destroyers in U.S. Navy, and they were pounding the Shia places every single day. Every single bomb will take away a football field.
A football?
A football field, just one. Okay, and it was from morning to evening, every day.
Off the coast of Lebanon.
Off the coast of Lebanon, in the Mediterranean. So when people talk about, look what the Iranians did, no one talks about what happened, why. This guy who actually took the Marines at the time, he lost both of his parents in one of these operations. They were killed. These were basically Shia villages, that they were pounding. So they came on
southern Shia villages on the border.
And on the Shuf mountain, because they were losing in the civil war. So they came on the side of the Christians against them. So, and then Reagan realized, very quickly that he can't win this. So he withdrew very quickly. And then that followed also by many other operations, because the thing is, we're going to make this agreement, the peace agreement with Israel, fail, because the Syrians didn't want it to succeed. They still have the Golan Heights. You can't have Lebanon there, which is basically their backyard, in peace with Israel. So they were, until they actually it fell, the whole thing fell. But the Iranians played a huge role in that, and then they played a huge role into establishing Hezbollah, which became a formidable force. Meanwhile, the Israelis were occupying southern Lebanon, and now you have another proxy war, so to speak.
Yeah, Eddie Nasser in his recent book has described this as the beginning of strategy of forward defense.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But
that came through decades of planning. So this is the beginning.
Is this the beginning of this?
This is the beginning, exactly. This is the beginning.
The formation has
Because before that there was Amal. Amal basically is a nationalist Shia movement, but it's not as Islamist as Hezbollah. So Hezbollah came. The Islamists within Amal left and they formed Hezbollah, and they became obviously under the tutelage of the Iranians. The Iranians trained them, financed them, gave them everything they want, and they built them into a formidable force.
Now, here is the another, skepticism around Iran. Maybe you can clarify. One of the things that Eddie Nasser mentioned in his recent book is long before defense, as I remember, is what he called it the Shia domain. That means that Iran relies heavily on basically these Shia pockets, Shia populations in the region, and he tries to describe that as a strategic depth for Iran. How do you read this kind of reading of Iran's foreign policy?
We can't explain it without going back to the Iran-Iraq war. Iran-Iraq war is a generational war. It's an 8-year
decade, right? It's almost a
8
decade.
years, 8 years, in which over 500,000 people were killed.
That's unbelievable.
They used chemical weapons.
When you say they, both sides, correct?
Actually, it's not clear the Iranians used it. There was never really any proof. But there is a proof that the Iraqis used it in Halkalı and other places. Obviously, a lot of people claim otherwise, but the fact is that we know for a fact through investigations, through other evidence, that the Iraqis used it against the Kurds and against the Iranians. And to them, this is the imprint in the mind of the Iranians, is that they are on their own. No one's going to come to their rescue. So their strategy has been that we need to have a forward defense, meaning that we don't want to fight in our land anymore.
Yeah, but I want to. I know that this is a misreading of Iran, but maybe you can clarify. A lot of people say this idea that they are all on their own doesn't actually emanate from realities on the ground, but rather is a product of a certain ideological commitment to being seen as kind of a minority group or minority mentality in which it prevents them from aligning interests with their neighbors and partners.
But that's true for any minorities. I mean, the Shia are a minority in the region.
Yeah.
And
No, but it translates into their foreign policy. I'm not too concerned about that.
I mean, every minority, every group, usually would be leery, and they will depend on themselves more. But in the case of Iran, it is true. Because if you review the history, you will find that most of the regimes in the region don't like them.
No, I'm saying that you said that the reason that they felt alone was because of what happened
No,
in
it's
the Iran
on the ground. Yes, $80 billion, $85 billion.
No, but I'm just to clarify the question. I'm saying that there's another argument where the reason they feel alone has nothing to do with what happened on the ground. It has to do with their own political psychology. They will always feel alone because they are committed to this kind of position. I'm saying that there's a kind of but you're saying that this is grounded in reality.
I mean, we have to look at the reality because this is not about feelings. It's about what actually happened on the ground.
Yeah, maybe you can clarify that.
What happened on the ground is that they were targeted militarily, economically, politically, isolated, even clandestinely. They were trying to destabilize the regime. There's all kind of evidence about how some of these operations, which are basically intelligence kind of operations, they will try to destabilize. Iran is made of 18 different ethnic groups. Every one of these ethnic groups, they will have a sponsor, in which that sponsor will try to destabilize the country. So they've been under tremendous pressure, whether it's like Azeris, you name it.
Yeah, well,
Somebody
interestingly, a huge Turkish population.
Yes. So each one of them.
The current president, for example, he comes from
Azeris. So you have all these things going on. And of course, the Persians, even though they make perhaps as much as 65 or 70%, they still, you have these large contingencies, particularly on the borders, in which they can. So they are very leery. In addition to being you perceive yourself as a persecuted minority in the larger scheme of things as Shias versus Sunnis and this and that. So that has going to happen. Now, even within that context, being an Islamist, you're still a minority within a minority. Because the ideology of Islam also is not embraced by every single person.
Especially a Khomeiniist, right? Because Khomeini's ideology is not even, at that time, mainstream.
Yes, not the dominant.
Dominant.
But he is able to organize millions of people through institutions in which it becomes the dominant ideology for the regime.
No, but your claim is that they're putting all that aside. There was a real isolationist policy against Iran that was orchestrated by its neighbors and also by great powers.
There was. I mean, there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt that they always had friction with all the neighbors. There is no doubt in the early days of the revolution, the rhetoric was very high, that they actually were more embracing of the Islamic ummah type thought rather than nationalistic. But that was toned down, particularly when Rafsanjani came into power. He's always been there, but his influence when he became a president. And of course, because of what happened during the Iran-Iraq war, they had to dial down and start looking at the interests of the Iranians per se, and that their best strategy would be to have forward defense, meaning that if we're going to fight, let's not fight in our territory, let's fight outside. Now, we haven't talked much about Israel, because Israel thought that this regime is also an ideological regime that you can't really reason with from their perspective. And therefore, Israel has played a huge role throughout this relationship. I was in the
U.S. and Iranian
I was in the United States, and I observed it every step of the way, whether it's in Congress, in political circles, think tanks, media, White House, State Department. Iran was always a problem for them.
And what is the Zionist reading of Iran? How do they read Iran?
First of all, the Zionists' reading of the region as a whole shifted pretty quickly during the First Intifada. In fact, the origins, I can trace the origins of Islamophobia to Israeli experts, Mossad agents in the United States coming to reside there, as well as to Hebrew writings and books.
I also, my experience in the United States has been very similar. That the First Intifada had even effects into small towns, and for the first time, outside of just the big policy circles in Washington D.C. I mean, you're talking about obscure states, like North Carolina and other swing states.
Absolutely right.
And huge influence of
Yes.
Zionism.
They started something called Task Force on Terrorism and Conventional Warfare in the late 80s in Congress, and because they couldn't attract Democrats, they renamed it into Republican Task Force. Yes, but the point here, of course, is the important point when it comes to these kind of things, is that this Intifada, which made the shift, was with the rise of Islamic movements in Palestine, which was embraced by Iran. So the first movement, Islamic Jihad, and then Hamas, which came in 1987, they were embraced by Iran, and after the invasion of Kuwait, and after they kicked out Saddam, there was a process called the MENA.
I have a question here. How, in normal nation-state logic, if Iran had the idea of supporting the Palestinian resistance, what a nation-state would have done in those times was to onboard regional partners. I mean, that would be the logical thing to do.
Correct.
Like, why go straight to solely backing militias in the region instead of trying to create conferences, a security apparatus, a security architecture in the region that would support this, instead stepping over the Egyptians, stepping over the Iraqis, stepping over the Syrians, and directly funding Palestinian resistance seems to be unconventional for a nation state.
It's a very good question. It takes you back now to the ideological nature of Iran. This is not a nation state in the same sense that other nation states are trying to advance their interests within the international system. They look at Palestine completely different. Even Khomeini is on the record, even the Palestinians sign and recognize Israel. Iran doesn't recognize Israel. Because fundamentally, it's immoral, it's unjust to recognize.
It reminds me of Mandela's stance, right?
يعني Mandela would have been okay with whatever the Palestinians were okay with. Even Khomeini went further, that he would not recognize Israel, even if the Palestinians recognize Israel, which happened, because Yasser Arafat recognized Israel, and still no one in Iran was willing to recognize Israel. So for them, this is a fundamental situation. You could even trace back to some of his speeches, even before the revolution succeeded. He would probably mention the Shah 10, 15 times in the speech, but Israel will be mentioned like 30 times. I mean, this was very, very personal, very important to always highlight the situation. So,
and what did he? I mean, because for example, in the region we see a lot of shadow diplomacy happening right now, where regional actors are trying to jostle for their own position. So you're saying Iran was not interested in onboarding regional partners and tackling this issue, or they had foregone the capacity, capability, or resolve of Arab states?
I think we have to look at it in different stages. In the first stage, Iran, I mean, Khomeini was there for 10 years, between 79 and 89. It was an absolute anathema for him to accept Israel or to give it any legitimacy whatsoever. After Khomeini passed away, after he died in 1989, and after we had all these initiatives, political initiatives, starting with the Madrid process, then with the Washington rounds, and then with the Oslo Accord, and then with this close relationship between the rise of the Islamic movements in Palestine and Iran, particularly the Jihad and Hamas, particularly after the first Intifada, and they embraced it in 1992. We could see in 1992, now we have two camps. We have the camp, which led by Fatah and the nationalists, which culminated into the Oslo Accord, in which they tried to find political accommodation, political solution, political horizon. And then you have the Islamists who totally reject this, and they think that this is a waste of time. Iran embraces this and starts supporting them, not in rhetoric. Iran became the only force in the world that is willing to fund not just political movements, but militias, in terms of arms, in terms of funding, in terms of training, in terms of logistics, in terms of many things. No other country not only doesn't do it, no other country even is willing to come close.
Going solo has a double-edged sword. Right? On one end, if you go solo, it shows resolve for principles. But to regional actors, it could almost seem like unity, like hegemonic action. But you don't ask permission. You just do what you believe to be true.
But this is not done in vacuum. You understand that there is a war going on. Israel never stopped waging a war against the Palestinians. It's not just that it was minding its own business and just people came. It's always been there. Because Israel wanted to, the reason it went through Madrid and then the Oslo Accord is because you could not defeat the Palestinians during the first Intifada. So the alternative is, okay, we couldn't do it militarily, let's see if we can do it otherwise. So there was this dialectic, this confrontation taking place, and Iran always came on the part of the Palestinians with real resources. So anyway, so part of that reason is that, again, the concept also of forward defense is very important. Iran is in the crosshairs of the Israelis. In 1996, when Clinton was coming in his second term, there has this documentation called Clean Break and the dual containment policy. So it was very clear that the Zionists in Washington also put Iran as, and of course with the rise of Netanyahu, that's when Netanyahu became the first time as prime minister, that they wanted to go and take on Iran head on. And to do that, obviously, they have to do many things, including, by the way, they passed in 1996 an act in Congress which was called the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. They put the squeeze on Iran. Very, very, very tough. And of course, as the years went on, we're talking about more and more of these sanctions, of these pressures. And the more you put pressure, the more you push back. The more you push back. And whenever Iran was trying to get some sort of a relationship with the United States, it was always the Zionists who will avoid it, make sure it doesn't happen. Including after 9/11, they have some, overtures. And Bush rejected that, and then he called them in 2002 the axis of evil. So that was locked down, even though they helped him in toppling the Taliban. That's a record.
Can we forward to our day now?
Yes, of
We
course.
have we've established a good foundation about
So what happened
the
is that
historical foundation. Maybe we can talk about, recently you wrote about the 4-stage process
right.
of regime change, and you also spoke about many other dynamics that are working in the region. There's also the nuclear question. I mean, is the contestation with Iran about its forward defense strategy, or is it the nuclear program, or both?
As I said earlier, one of the existential threats that Israel feels it has to deal with is the nuclear thing. It wants to monopolize nuclear weapons. It's not going to allow any other regional country to possess nuclear weapons, because that would utilize its own nuclear weapons, and in that case it would feel vulnerable. So it's been after any country. It's been after Iraq in 1981, Syria in 2007, after Iran for many, many, many years, cooperating with the United States through different intelligence operations, secret operations, sabotage, and so on and so forth, killing Iranian nuclear scientists and so on and so forth. So that's been front and center. And of course, when
Also
the
cyber attacks.
yes, when the JCPOA came in 2015, he was totally against it because it gave Iran the ability to enrich uraniums, and that by itself could eventually be used. So they were totally against it. They were able to get Trump to basically tear it apart. So that's been front and center, and they're trying to do this. And I think they concluded that the only way to deal with the Iranian regime is through regime change, that they can't reform this regime, that they can't make it change. Now, there is interesting documents that came recently as a result of the seizure of computers that the Israelis had from Hamas. In these computers, there is a correspondence between Ismail Haniyeh, the former head of Hamas, and Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar, the leader of the fundamentals. These correspondences were taking place in 2022 and 2023, in which Sinwar basically gives Haniyeh 3 scenarios, which are prelude to what happened on October 7th. This group within Hamas believed that they could actually bloody the Israelis in order to get certain concessions, whether it's on the siege, whether it's on other things. And he lays out these 3 scenarios, in which the first scenario says, we can go through this phase, we can bloody Israel as an axis of resistance. Iran is involved, Hezbollah is involved, the Houthis are involved, the Iraqis are involved, we are involved.
They felt
All
they
of
had
us.
enough capacity.
All of us, that we can do this, and we can really do lots of damage to them. That's scenario 1. The second scenario is everybody gets involved except Iran, because Iran is a state, has its own calculations. And if the other groups are not ready, then we can do it alone, but we need support. And he basically talks about that support. What's interesting is that Haniyeh responds back and he says, please discuss it with them. So Haniyeh responds back to him and says, I discussed only scenario 1 and 2. So he did not discuss scenario 3, which was actually happened October the 7th. The Israelis know for a fact that the Iranians were surprised. They didn't know that this was going to happen.
Wow.
Because they were never informed of this. And of course, the Iranians didn't say yes or no about they said, we need to talk about it. We're not going to agree to this, but we can talk about it. In another correspondence, Sinwar gives a price, that this operation will cost that much. Haniyeh responds back by saying, I secured 40%, in which the Islamic Republic had already paid about half, and the remaining half, or 60%, they will also pay, which shows commitment And that's why the Israelis want to go after Iran. They know Iran is pretty much committed.
Yeah, but that's
To
been
support.
established by the history that you.
Exactly, but now you have it in black and white. Now they have it in documentation that this is Iran is, and then they talk about the technology of the tunnels and the missiles and this. So Iran is up to its ears in this situation. That's why the Israelis concluded that the only way to deal with this, we cannot reform them, we cannot change them, we cannot have them, we cannot get any way with them. We have to finish them, we have to break them up.
Yeah, can you now talk about the theory of imminent collapse? I mean, we've had Washington, experts predict this in 2013, 13, 19. I mean,
Since
every year.
1999, they're predicting that Iran will collapse. See, this is a problem with elites. It's wishful thinking. They do not understand the sociology of a revolution. They don't.
Can you speak about that, the sociology of a revolution?
Yes, Iran is not a state that is made of small pockets here and there. This is an ideological state. You have millions of people who have already been trained and they have already been part of a society that its main purpose is to make sure that revolution, that country will stay intact as it is. Yes, Iran is 92 million, but you don't need 90 million to sustain that. If you only have 3 or 5 million, like in the Siege, the Revolutionary Guards, and all these people who are in major parts of the country, that's enough for you to sustain a country, a revolution. You only need 1 or 2% actually of the whole population committed to the ideology to sustain that revolution. That's the sociology of the revolution. If you have 2 million people willing to die for a country, you can't defeat that country. It's an illusion for people to think that somehow because you have 2,000 here and there agitators or provocateurs, or they have certain things or certain affinity, that they somehow they're going to be able to topple the government. That's nonsensical. That's not going to happen. It's just not true. Iran, I don't think there is any, perhaps Cuba is an exception, any country in the world today that has been subject to sanctions like Iran did. And yet they're able to manufacture high-level technology and defense industry. You know that the number of engineers around the world, the 4th country that produces engineers around the world is Iran, under all these things. After China and Russia and the United States, you have Iran. So you got all these things to its advantage. They are very highly motivated. Yes, they have tremendous problems. They have sanctions and they have economic collapse and they have mismanagement and perhaps corruption. All that exists. No one would deny that. But still an ideological state.
Can I press this point a little bit? Because from one angle, we see an Iran that is committed to an ideological position. On the other hand, some may argue that what's the benefit of an ideology if you can't, buy bread? What's the benefit of an ideology which wages expensive wars abroad, and yet people in the country are facing hardship?
That's the debate taking place today between what's called the reformists and the fundamentalists. So you have, these ideologues are not also totally stringent or fixated.
I mean, you've got major problems. Like there's a water crisis in Iran. There's a foreign currency problem, and then not to mention that. Logistically, even getting the oil out, selling it, it's done through ghost tankers and all kinds of different maneuvers that have to be done due to the sanctions that have been imposed on the country. But all of this seems to be, from one perspective, a stubborn commitment.
This is how I would explain it always. And I think it's very important that we understand this. These are not people who are fixated in ideology, but they are principles.
But that's how it's depicted, right?
Yes, but they are principles, meaning that if I'm going to compromise on sovereignty, on independence, on some of these red lines, I would not. But I'm willing to compromise on these things. I will give you several examples, but that's the principle here. The reformists are different. The difference between one is more nomadic, if an Islamist, you probably can understand what that means. One is more localist. They're willing to compromise. They said, I'm not going to be more Palestinian than the Palestinians. The principalists among them said, no, we cannot compromise in Israel. Because Israel is not just a Palestinian problem, it's a national security problem for us. That's how they look at it. But it's getting back to the situation, because you raised a very important point about what's happening currently, and I think I need to elaborate a little bit about that. So what happens is that Iran was surprised with the Tufan al-Aqsa, but it did not retreat like many other Muslim countries. They said, okay, you made that decision, you bear it. It tried to help in terms of assisting. So it basically hinted to all its allies within the axis of resistance to do something about it. So Hezbollah waged in the north, the Houthis in the Red Sea, Iraqis here and there. They tried to help in different situations, but they obviously were not in a way now to judge it or evaluate everything. But they tried that and they paid heavy price. So now the Israelis want to avenge this situation. And
can't we argue that they made a tactical mistake? They should have thrown their hat in the ring. I mean, it seems like they were measured until Iran was threatened directly, and then we saw the missiles rain on Tel Aviv. Those arsenals, that capacity could have been used much earlier to prevent a genocide. Correct.
It's in hindsight 2020. I mean, people say
even Hezbollah's arsenal was waiting on standby for all intents and purposes.
But this argument ignores the fact that we have a huge domestic opposition to this. Had Hezbollah went full force, Chinese society, Lebanese society would have been split completely. Even in Iran, you don't have consensus in going to war. You have consensus to defend yourself. To help the Palestinians. It's not an easy thing to go to war. And then public opinion-wise, I mean, if you're going to go full force, you only go full force as a matter of necessity, not as a matter of choice. If Iran goes after Israel as a matter of choice, there is a different price you pay than when you go after necessity. Necessity, because that way you have no other choice. Israel always has a matter of choice. But for us, or at least for the Iranians and others, it's mostly out of necessity, not out of choice. So what Iran did is that it tried to help the Palestinians. It could have done exactly what other Muslim countries did. Humanitarian aid, rhetoric, media, international law policy. No, it played a larger role, and it played a huge price for it. I'm sure, in my view, it played with the life of its president, foreign minister. All of them were assassinated, senior leadership. We're talking about huge. And with the change of American administration and the embrace of the Israeli agenda, of course, it paid more. So now we get to this point. Now Iran was because it came in the crosshair with the Israelis know that this is not a reformed regime. This regime must be changed. This regime must go away by any ways, either break up the country or regime change. That is basically the Israeli posture. They tried that in the last November. They gambled and they lost, because the elites think that they can actually get it to fracture, and they lost. Actually, it was a 12-day war. Towards the end, it was the Israelis who were pleading with the Americans to stop the war. It wasn't the Iranians could have gone a few weeks more, but the Iranians learned so much from it in terms of the military tactics and strategies. So this time around, it's going to be much more prepared.
Can you give us your insight into what you may think is going to conclude with the talks? They are, from what I can tell, they aren't progressing very quickly, or
yes.
They're not making a lot of progress. What do you foresee in the future now?
Okay, we're going to talk about three things and maybe conclude after that.
Yeah.
Number one, what actually happened in the past 6 weeks? What actually happened in the past 6 weeks is the Israelis concluded that this regime cannot be reformed, and therefore we need to change it. And to change it, they went through a four-step process.
Yes.
First is to make sure that the economic needs of the state would collapse. That was done through short selling the reals. in Dubai. And that, of course, that it was very
Immediately felt, yes.
immediately. I mean, it could be predicted.
They lost like 40% of
For,
it.
yeah, I mean, we're talking about
Overnight.
1.6 million riyals per dollar.
Yeah.
So people were on the streets, by themselves. I mean, it wasn't. And then the second step, that was the four-step process. The second step would be to get the agitators into the streets and start to target state institutions, including police officers, police stations, certain areas, burn them down and create chaos in the streets. The third would have been the propaganda war, in which we prepare the whole world, and the fourth would be the military strikes, in which we have decapitation strategy, try to kill as many of the leaders as possible, and try to foment this air of that this is imminent collapse and the end of the regime. It was all wishful thinking. And of course, before that, they distributed tens of thousands of Starlink because they know that they need communication.
Yeah, but it's very strange. It seems like they went through 3 and didn't do the 4th.
Because what happened is that the
They
Iranians were able
burned a whole network of
of their assets that they had.
assets in Iran.
So they were able to actually to identify, perhaps through Russian and Chinese means, these Starlink terminals. They were able to seize them because they shut down the internet and they were able to isolate them. And before Trump got into the military strikes, which was supposed to be the last step, these demonstrations ended basically. So that failed, but also Iranians were very smart in identifying what the targets are, and they prepared for all contingencies, including if the worship of the supreme leader was killed, who's going to succeed him, and if he's killed, who's going to succeed him, and so on and so forth, who's going to succeed the president. They did the whole thing, and then they had 12 different commands, which are basically decentralized. So there's no longer you can kill a command and control center. Even if Tehran is different from Isfahan, is different from Mashhad, is different from Tabriz, everybody is the same. So you can't, you're like fighting 12 different countries. And then they had all this technology coming from China and Russia in terms of air defense. And then they have, because of the time lead since last June, when they were trying to decapitate and break up the country, they were able to manufacture tens of thousands of missiles, hypersonic, down to really real damage.
Yeah, well, we saw that in the 12-day war. The hypersonic missiles were almost unstoppable by the Iron Dome.
Yes.
I mean, the other ones, the kind of old arsenal that Iran used was what we saw, but the hypersonics went straight through.
Absolutely, and they were able to actually manufacture more. And then Netanyahu himself called Trump on January 14th, telling him if the object is to change the regime, collapse the regime, we're with you. It can take 4 days of bombing up to 700 missiles. But if the regime is not going to fall, we can't take it. Stop. He himself actually was advocating this because he knew that this goes on and on and on, there will be no success. And I think Trump realized over time from his military officers that this is not a winnable strategy. He can't collapse the regime. It can't be done, and therefore he stopped it. And now, so what's happening now? What's happening now is that he has this armada, as you said earlier, called diplomacy, trying to convince the Iranians that they would be devastated, that they would, face tremendous amount of firepower if they do not cave in. Now, there's always 3 things. Netanyahu just concluded a meeting with Trump, in which obviously they want to do regime change. It's not possible. So the next thing that they want is to curb the nuclear program, not just to curb it, but to stop enrichment to 0, which the Iranians will never allow. Number 2 is that they want to put restrictions on the missile program so that they don't reach Israel. No, that's a suicide. That's the only reason that they can survive today is because their ability to hit Israel and to punish Israel.
It's the only deterrence they have.
Yes, exactly. And the third one is that they wanted to completely stop supporting Hezbollah and Hamas and the other groups, which are not willing even to negotiate. So this is where we are. Now, Trump met with Netanyahu yesterday, and according to Trump's tweet, according to his post, is that he is going to continue the negotiations. He did not listen to Netanyahu.
He's giving it a month, right?
no one really knows. He basically says we're going to negotiate, and he didn't say anything about the missile, he didn't say anything about the support, so he's focused on the nuclear situation. Now, if that's his focus, they can reach an agreement, because the Iranians have no problem curbing their
Because they already agreed with JCPOA.
Exactly, and they're probably willing to go even further. They're willing to hand over the enrichment uranium, about 400 plus kilos of about 60%. They're willing to hand that over to Russia. But in exchange for something, this is not free. There has to be lifting of sanctions. So it can't be just they do their thing and nothing happens. And they are very adamant, and basically they threaten. So the scenarios...
Yeah, but that's not really a victory, because that was what was agreed in the JCPOA.
Even for Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
It's just going back to
Exactly.
the starting position.
Exactly. So what we have here are three possibilities. Maybe we can end with this, or unless you have questions. Scenario one is where you have symbolic exchange of fire. I doubt very much that will happen, because just too much at stake right now. This is what happened actually before in June. We sent 14 missiles, I sent 14 missiles, we agreed, and Trump is not in a good condition right now, domestically or internationally. So he doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver, particularly with the collapse of the economy and the standing in the world. The second, see, out of these three scenarios, two are predictable. The third is the one that is not predictable. So the second possibility, which I doubt also that we will carry out, is to have a devastating, full-out war. He goes after Iran with all forces, hoping the regime to collapse, complete decapitation. But the price would be huge, because if he goes after Iranian oil facilities, and they go after all the facilities in the region, and they mine or close the Strait of Hormuz, we're talking about a catastrophic situation where the whole economic lifeline of the world is shut down, and where you have, in fact, nothing that can predict what could be the state of the world, both strategically, militarily, economically, and so on and so forth. And in that case, I don't think he can still defeat Iran, because Iran has all these bases. He has all these vulnerable assets. When you talk about Abraham Lincoln, which is the crown piece in the American Navy, it's not that difficult to drown it, because it's still sitting there. And all what they have to do is, with all the armada that they have,
Yeah, Iranian drones have already located it, and they're already tracked.
it can be sunk. And that would be a huge problem for Trump and the Americans. The reputation will be in the gutters. So that's not an easy thing to do. And I don't think his admirals and his generals are telling him that they can get away with it. They can inflict major harm on Iran, but they could also take a huge beating. And I don't think Trump likes to be...
And it's still hanging out in the Arabian Sea. It's not really...
Yes.
It hasn't come within fire range of Iran, so...
No, but
I mean,
Iran
the range of Iranian fire...
Iran has missiles that are 13 Mach and 12 Mach and 16 Mach and 8 Mach. It's not that difficult to get them. All Iran has to do... Okay, when you look at the defenses, when you listen to experts, they can probably go after 50 or 100 missiles. They can go over 300 or 400. And they have that capacity. So it's a suicide for the Americans to do. So that would be obviously the nightmare scenario. If they think they can get away with it, they will do it, but I don't think they can get away with it. The third scenario, which is unpredictable, which is what's called escalation ladder. So you start and they try to escalate. Then becomes the calculation of the Iranians. How much are they willing to go to the point where the Americans don't escalate and at the same time they do not surrender? Now the Iranians are on the record saying that they're not going to do that. They're going to go full force. Everybody is going to be a fair game. I think they might go after Israel more than the United States in this situation, because they believe that Israel will pressure the US to stop the war. So they may go thousands of missiles against Israel, hoping that Israel will be forced.
What about the Arab regimes on the border?
They are terrified.
That would also...
Absolutely, they are terrified. Now, we haven't even spoken about the proxies, because the Houthis will go after the Arab regimes. The Iraqis will go after the American bases in Iraq. The Hezbollah will go after northern Israel. The Hezbollah. The Houthis will go after perhaps Saudi installations. I mean, this is a completely nightmare scenario for all to see. That's everybody's trying to stop this. But the Israelis also are afraid, because they can never be sure that Iran's not going to go full force and really punish them hard this time.
We've run out of time, and thank you so much for your insight. I appreciate your time. and I want to thank everybody who's joined us online.
Thank you.